warmly welcome you to this. It's flashing on my screen here. I warmly welcome you to this evening. I speak to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture, which is the first of 4 lectures the Diocese of Ottawa will be offering as we mark the 125th anniversary of the founding of this particular church. And it's very important for us at this time not to look backwards with nostalgic eyes, but rather to put our eyes forward, very much in the present, looking forward, and to be more prospective than retrospective, to listen to things that we need to hear now as a people who face the future, things that are important to our life as a church and to the world around us. The Anglican Church of Canada was a perpetrator with respect to residential schools. And it acknowledged that as a body, repented, sought forgiveness, offered 2 heartfelt apologies, and had put itself on a path to be a reconciler, recognizing there has to be a profoundly new relationship with Indigenous peoples. We're very pleased tonight to be collaborating with our All My Relations Circle to offer this lecture this evening. The lecture is being recorded. There will be a time for questions and answers after Michelle's lecture. If you have a question, please type it into the chat function, and we will be making note of the questions, and a selection of questions will be offered after the lecture. Please keep your mute button on at all times. In my experience, when an Indigenous person is speaking, the very best place for a non-Indigenous person to be is on mute. We need to make space as non-Indigenous people to listen to Indigenous voices. And Michelle Good will provide us with a strong and wise voice this evening. Michelle is a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation on Treaty 6 territory. She began her vocation as a teenager working with Indigenous organizations and worked for over 20 years before becoming a lawyer in her early 40s. Her practice of law was primarily concerned with advocacy for residential school survivors. And it's now clear to us, at least, who look on, however remotely, on her life, that she felt another calling, another urge, another desire to express, and she obtained a Master's of Fine Arts in 2014 and is now very well known as an author. Michelle is an advocate, a poet, and an author, and her novel, 5 Little Indians, won the 2020 Governor General's Literary Award for English language fiction. The book is a work of fiction, but it tells the truth. It tells many truths about the insidious and pervasive reach of the residential school experience. And though it's set in the past, it speaks of the reality of residential schools for Indigenous people today. And so, Michelle, it's a great honor to have you with us tonight, and we look forward to hearing your words. I'll pass things over to you now.
Thank you, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight. I'm thankful for the invitation and an opportunity to continue with the work that I've chosen to do with my life, which is to, I like to call it lighting a dialogue fire. In our traditions, we have spirit fires that are lit at the commencement of important events and ceremonies, and they stay lit until the matter is resolved, until the situation, the ceremony, the event is concluded. And so I am trying to light a dialogue fire between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, with an urge to really come to understand what reconciliation will entail, with a full understanding of the truth, because there can't be truth. I mean, there can't be reconciliation without truth, without a deep and meaningful understanding of not only what happened, but the context in which it happened, and the forever impacts, the impacts that continue to roll on through the generations as we move forward in time, and hopefully forward in time in the most meaningful ways. I'd like to start today by acknowledging that December 6th is, of course, the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women, arising out of the senseless violence that took so many women's lives at the École Polytechnique de Montréal. And it is so important to remember the senseless act of violence. And from an Indigenous woman's perspective, this day should also consider and keep the long history of violence against Indigenous women alive in our everyday consciousness. There are two books that I'm going to refer to in this commentary. One of them is called Clearing the Plains by James Daschuk. And in that, it's one of the most striking histories that I've read, one of the most accurate histories of the time of such impactful efforts at colonization of the what was the Northwest Territories, which we understand now as Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the Dakotas, the Montana, all of that was part of the Northwest Territories. But this book gives a wonderful history. I mean, it's horrible, but it's wonderful in its completeness in terms of the way women were used to promote the colonial agenda. And there were fur trading companies that would take the wives of Indigenous men and hold them hostage until the men agreed that they would trap for profit. Because of course, prior to this, they only trapped for what they needed. In addition to this, there was correspondence to Ottawa about the conduct of members of the Northwest Mounted Police, members of the Department of Indian Affairs, who were sexually brutalizing young Indigenous girls, to which a certain father of Confederation responded by stating, "Oh, this is nothing to worry about. It's just a bride price. They're always looking for a bride price. So, it's all just about, don't worry about these little girls." And, the terrorization of Indigenous women is so deeply woven into the fabric of Canadian society. The objectification continues. And I've been doing some research for another project, and I've been reading this tremendously interesting book. Which is entitled Distorted Descent, White Claims to Indigenous Identity. And it deals with both individual and collective efforts to usurp Indigenous identity. And in the course of Dr. Darryl LaRue, who wrote the book, in the progress of his research, he noted a number of online sites where people were talking about these false claims to indigeneity. And there was a scholar who articulated in this forum that really in Quebec, only 1% of people, of Indigenous people, well, only 1% of Indigenous women in the 1600s, in fact, married French men. And the marriage to the French men was, the basis for this false claim to indigeneity. And one of the quotes that was in one of these forums from a non-Indigenous man in 2013, which is not a long time ago, and only 2 years before the inquiry to the missing and murdered Indigenous women, we hear this description: "I have a hard time believing this percentage. when I imagine the first French colonists arriving here and seeing gorgeous, hairless Indian girls, bare-breasted and sexually promiscuous. Nothing could be further from the truth in terms of the manner in which Indigenous women were respected in their communities and were and carried themselves. So I just felt that it was important to acknowledge this day, December 6th, and to acknowledge that this violence against Indigenous women continues, and to see this kind of attitude in this modern day is horrifying to me and should be horrifying to everybody. Residential schools. I think of them as being a part of a colonial toolkit. There were people that came to this country and they sought something. And you Google colonialism and you'll find 7 million essays, papers, conceptions, definitions, articulations of post-colonial, pre-colonial, et cetera, But I find that the most useful thing is to just look at the actual definition of colonialism. And that is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. There, in a nutshell, is the story of colonial Canada. The people that came to this land did so with a very specific economic agenda. And that agenda is one that we continue to live with to this day in terms of the never-ending exploitation of natural resources. It was never intended that Indigenous people through treaty, or, we have the unceded territories in British Columbia and other places as well. It was never intended that we would be confined to these little tiny reserves, never at all. But what I'd like to do is just go through a little bit of history. They're little snapshots from history, and they'll lead us up to the residential school days, if you will. So I'm going to go back to 1870. And at that time, the American government encouraged the slaughter of the buffalo as a strategy to conquer the American Plains Indians. General Sheridan, a well-known Indian killer, said this: "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo are exterminated. Then your prairies can be covered with speckled cattle and festive cowboys." I'm having a hard time imagining a festive cowboy, but anyway, I think you get the picture. The recognition of the buffalo as food, clothing, and shelter for Indigenous people was not lost on Canada. And we have to consider Canada. The border between America and Canada doesn't exist for us. We have, Indigenous communities that are bisected by that border. That didn't exist, and it certainly didn't exist for the buffalo. There was no border wall preventing the buffalo from, moving north to Canada as they did on their natural migrations. There were approximately 4 million buffalo slaughtered in Canada. Again, our food, clothing, and shelter. I'm a Cree woman from the prairies. I relate to this very personally. And Sir John A. Macdonald then defined this as a policy of submission based on a policy of starvation. And that was the clear intent, was to starve Indigenous people in what was the Northwest Territories into submission so that they would take treaty. And ultimately, that's what happened. In 1875, Catholic Bishop Grandin made this statement in support of residential schools, or the continued practice of taking children away from their communities and placing them in these institutions. He said, "We instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood." And so if there is anyone left in the country that thinks that these institutions arose out of a good intention, about a well-intentioned objective, then that in and of itself should disabuse them of that perspective. In 1879, Nicholas Flood Davin, who was a member of the House of Commons, following the formation of the Department of Indian Affairs and the passage of the first Indian Act in 1876, he was dispatched, if you will, to look at the residential school or industrial school program that existed in the US. And he did that with particular emphasis on the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, came back and reported to his boss, the Prime Minister, Sir John A., of the internal workings of what was known as the industrial schools, industrial boarding schools in the United States. And he came back with a strong, he was very impressed with the method of funding Indian schools, which they were referred to, and was a working title for my book at one point. And highly recommended the relationship, or the model of contracting education with the religious institutions, to piggyback where religious institutions had schools already, and to just pay the per capita basis for the care and so-called education of the children. He stated to the government, wherever the missionaries have schools, the government should utilize those schools if possible. That is to say, a contract should be made with the religious body controlling the school to board and educate and train industrially a certain number of pupils. This should be done without interfering with the small assistance at present given to the day mission schools. Davin reported that in the States, this education was used as a method of forced assimilation. And he stated that in this new way to deal with the Indian problem by education and assimilation, as opposed to murder, I guess, it seemed that the United States had found that such boarding schools, as they were called, to be quite effective in deconstructing young Indians. That was our Canadian member of Commons, deconstructing young Indians. In 1883, in a House of Commons debate, Sir John A. Macdonald stated that when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with the parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. White men, I notice. They don't even mention white women. Anyway, and so again, we see this drive to assimilate. And I'll talk about that in a minute, about whether it is assimilation or something else entirely. In 1885, Ms. Dahimasqua, Big Bear, who is my ancestor, my direct ancestor, was involved in the incident at Frog Lake in the Northwest Territories. And through the policy of starvation that I mentioned earlier, submission through starvation, in spite of the promises and multiple promises to provide rations, these rations were being withheld. And they were being withheld on the instruction of the federal government, because Big Bear wouldn't take treaty until he was certain that it would protect and provide for his people. And so there was an event where the war chiefs, separate from Big Bear, had enough. The children were eating twig soup. They were starving, and there was a conflagration, and non-Indigenous people died. In 1885, this is when this happened. And of course, the Northwest Mounted Police were quickly dispatched to bring these people in. General Frederick Middleton wrote a letter to Big Bear in 1885. I think it was in June of 1885. And he said this was following Batoche. And he says, I've utterly defeated Riel at Batoche with great loss and have made prisoners of Riel, Poundmaker, and his principal chiefs. Also, first of all, I have to say this is the longest run-on sentence in history. The entire letter is one sentence. I'm going to start again. I have utterly defeated Riel at Batoche with great loss and have made prisoners of Riel, Poundmaker, and his principal chiefs, also the two murderers of Payne and Tremont. And I expect that you will come in with all your prisoners, who I am glad to hear that you have treated fairly well, and your principal chiefs, and give up the men who have committed murders at Frog Lake. If you do not, I will pursue you and destroy you and your band, or drive you into the woods to starve. General Frederick Middleton, Commander, Northwest Field Force. And we have to consider, when we're thinking about this, that the Northwest Mounted Police are the precursor to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police honor that history. It's not surprising they do, it's institutional. But in doing that, those same sentiments, unfortunately, are just woven deeply into their institutional fabric. And hence we see very troubled relationships between Indigenous people and the Northwest Mounted Police. In 1907, Peter Henderson Bryce, who was the first medical officer for the Department of Indian Affairs, was commissioned to do a study of the conditions, the living conditions in residential school. This was arising from serious complaints from parents and some other people as well. Among other things, I mean, it was a very detailed report, and it dealt with, the conditions generally in terms of nutrition, ventilation, and general health. And one of the things that he reported back was that Indian boys and girls are dying like flies. Even war seldom shows as large a percentage of fatalities as the education system we have imposed on our Indian wards. Dr. Bryce, one of my heroes, was summarily fired. None of his recommendations about dealing with the conditions that were basically promoting tuberculosis, not basically, they were completely promoting the spread of tuberculosis. None of those recommendations were put into place. In 1918, responding to similar criticism, Duncan Campbell Scott, then Superintendent of Indian Affairs, said, "It is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness, habituating so closely in the residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution. A final solution of our Indian problem. It is quite within the mark to say that 50% of the children who passed through these schools did not live to benefit from the education which they had received therein." 50%. We are seeing the unmarked graves being identified, and the shock that non-Indigenous Canada is registering to the notion that there were these little kids that died and were buried unceremoniously with no indication of who they were, how they lived, with no effort to repatriate their remains to their parents. But 2021, this was known in 1907. This was known in 1918. This was known in 2015, when the Truth and Reconciliation Report and the calls to action under calls to action 71 through 76 come under the heading of missing children and burial information. And, a budget of about $1.5 million was recommended to the federal government to begin the work of identifying these burial sites and to repatriating these little children, sending them home so they could be taken care of properly. Mr. Harper was our prime minister at the time, and he said, no, And I mean, Mr. Trudeau has now funded it, but only after Indigenous people took the initiative and incurred the expense to begin to locate some of these children's bodies in these unmarked graves. I also note that the term final solution was first coined by a Canadian. It was first coined by Duncan Campbell Scott before, decades actually, before Hitler used the term of the final solution with respect to the genocide of the Jewish people during the Second World War. In 1920, attendance at these schools was made mandatory. Now, think about this. There's been a report that the kids are dying like flies. They're dying with a greater frequency than what you see on the battlefield. There's an acknowledgement of that. But it's not as important as assimilating these little kids and getting rid of the Indian problem. 1920, in spite of that information, the attendance is made mandatory. And when arguing in favor of the bill to make it mandatory, Duncan Campbell Scott said, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole object of this bill." And so I'm going to go back to the comment I made about, was this a policy of assimilation? And I say no. I used to think that it was only assimilation, that's what it was, but my thinking has evolved. And in fact, in my view, this is genocide. In the definition of genocide that was developed following the Second World War, there were 5 definitions of genocide. The 5th of those is the removal of children from one group to another. This was a systematic removal of children from Indigenous communities with the specific and articulated objective of dismembering families, communities, and nations. And so when we think of this, when we turn our minds to reconciliation, we have to think about that this was a specific and intentional effort to kill us one way or another, either literally or, as Bishop Grandin would have it, so that there was nothing native left of us except our blood. My mother attended an Anglican-run residential school. She attended the St. Barnabas Residential School in Onion Lake. And before her, her mother attended the Battleford Industrial School in North Battleford. Maybe I could ask you to put up picture 1 and picture 2, if you can do it together, but maybe one after the other, if not. So there's my mom. The third one in, the little girl, where you can see her hand on the sign, that's my mother. And then further down by 2 persons, that's her older sister. And behind the older sister is her older brother. And then the back row is my Uncle Frank, her other older brother. He's the, not the one in the striped center, but the one beside him. Look at the faces on these little children. They don't look cared for. If we could go to picture 2, please. This is my mom again. She's the one closest to your left with the red arrow, and her older sister is the one behind her. And what really What this really makes me think of is little children behind barbed wire in their Holocaust clothes, and how anybody could think that these little kids were cared for, provided for, is simply beyond me. I'll ask you now to go to picture 3, which is a picture of my kukum. Here's my kukum. This was taken at the Battlefield's Industrial School, and it's actually edited, so it's just a picture of my grandma. But it is there's 6 of them in this picture, and every single one of them has exactly the same hairstyle. And it again, I mean, it seems a small thing, but hair is very sacred to us. And the regulation hairstyle, how to be as white as you could possibly be. And that's my beautiful grandma, whose hair I never saw in anything but a braid, if that can be some satisfaction about all of that. So I'm going to take this moment right here to read an excerpt from my novel. And I am, because what this chapter is about, it's about one of my characters, Clara, is based on something that actually happened to my mother and another little girl at the St. Barnabas Indian Residential School. Okay. Clara sat at the table, oblivious to the empty beer glasses, the overflowing ashtray, and the noise of too many conversations straining to be heard above the pounding music. She smoldered alone, her friends now gone after their celebration of Lucy's success. Her anger, a slow, quiet burn, gnawed at her as she thought of Harlan and how he tried to make Lucy feel small. She slapped her last 5 on the table as the barmaid set down 2 glasses of half-flat draft beer. She downed one without a breath and went slower on the second, the deep drags on her smoke almost calming her. "Hey, baby, you all alone?" Clara looked up to see the owner of the voice, a tall white guy, bearded, blonde hair down to his ass. "If it weren't for the beard, I would swear you were a girl with all that hair. Bugger off." "Aw, no need for that. Just trying to be friendly. Can I buy you a beer?" Impatient now, she glared at him. "Do I look friendly to you? You must be new here." He put his hand on her shoulder, once again offering to buy her a beer. Clara shrugged his hand away. "Back off, man. What is your problem?" Anger rose in his voice as he flopped down at her table. "I heard all you Indian chicks were easy." Clara leapt from her chair, flew across the round bar table, and wrapped her hands around his neck. They tumbled to the floor, Clara pressing her thumbs into his windpipe. They rolled around the floor as the man desperately tried to pry her hands free from his neck. The room was silent to Clara as she straddled him and started bashing his head on the floor. His terrified eyes looked up at her, his mouth forming words, but she heard only a faint, pulsating buzz in her ears. His eyes were rolling into the back of his head when they dragged her off him, the bouncers hauling her to the door, her feet off the ground, kicking at them in the air. They pushed on through the swinging doors and threw her on the pavement. She jumped up and went for the biggest bouncer, wildly punching at his thick frame. He grabbed her by the shoulders, swung and slapped her across the face so hard she collapsed onto the wet pavement. Cars crawled by with their windows rolled down for the show. People on the street gave her a wide berth. "Stay the fuck out of here. You're banned for a month." The bouncers straightened their clothes and headed back into the bar. Sound slowly returned to her as her face burned, the imprint of the bouncer's hand pulsing with rage. She slowly got to her feet, slapping away a soggy cigarette butt that had stuck to her jeans. She looked up just as a city cop loomed down at her. She turned her back to him. "Nothing to see here. I'm leaving. See?" She took a few steps away. "See?" The cop moved towards her. "I know you. Troublemaker." He put his hand on his baton. "Move along now. If I see you here again tonight, you'll spend the night in the tank." Yeah. Clara walked away from him. Her legs moved as though independent of her will, and she let them take her back in the direction of the Manitou. The crowds thinned once she got away from East Hastings. Once there, she leaned against a lamppost, watching the hookers come and go, hurrying back towards Hastings, hoping they had enough time for another trick. The Johns left bedraggled and shameful, looking this way and that, hoping for no witnesses. Clara walked a little farther to the bus stop bench and sat, the aches and pains of the night's brawl starting to set in. She lost count of the number of buses she waved along as she sat, watching the Manitou sign, its red glow deepening and thinning as it made its lazy orbit. The fluorescent light of the office blazed as the night clerk flipped through the magazines and drank bottle after bottle of cola from the machine. At 3 a.m., the clerk locked the front door. Any late night guests would have to ring the buzzer. He turned all the lights out except the one illuminating the door. Of course, the big neon sign blazed red all night. With one last look out the window, the clerk left the lobby and retreated to what Clara knew was a small bedroom in the back. Harlan had tried to drag her in there more than once. The night clerk would sleep there, hoping for no interruptions. Clara watched the comings and goings of the hookers and their Johns for a while longer. Her swaying foot hit up against the cement footing of the bench as the idea took shape. What would piss Harlan off more than not having any chambermaids to work? She scanned the ground in front of her, stood and circled the bench, looking until she found a rock the size of a softball. She picked it up and sat down on the bench again, passing it back and forth from one hand to the other, thinking about how her mother had always called rocks the stone people. She sat until there'd been no movement at the Manitou for a while, and then waited a little longer. The rock felt warm in her hand as she sat in the drizzling rain, her clothes now completely soaked through, her hair straggly and wet. Finally, she rose, stiff from sitting so long and looking around carefully. The place was deserted, the hookers sleeping off another rough night. She slowly stepped off the curb and walked toward the office, then turned back and sat on the bench again, her heart pounding. Her mind turned once more to the mission school, but this time she thought of Lily. The days passed at school, one like the other, distinguished only by who was caught stealing food or who otherwise met with sister's wrath. One morning, as thin sunlight poured through the dorm window, Clara lay still, not wanting to leave the warmth of her bed, the dorm too drafty and the linoleum floors too cold for bare feet. She turned to the bed on her left, where Lily had the gray woolen blanket pulled around her head, her face almost completely hidden, but for her dark circled eyes. How many days, Clara? 7, just 6 more sleeps. The teacher told me. 3 days before Christmas, we go home. Lily sat up on the side of her bed, tucking her knees under her, the blanket now wrapped around her like a tent. How do we get home? I don't know. My mom never told me. Maybe we'll go in the cattle truck again. Clara shivered. We better get up and make our beds before sister gets here. Lily slipped off her bed, hugging herself for warmth as her feet hit the floor. I'll help you. Clara jumped out of the bed and helped Lily pull the blankets tight over her cot. Lily, in turn, helped Clara. The girls were reaching for their clothes when sister slipped into the dorm, her whistling hand, looking left and right for a sleeping girl. On your knees, girls, I want to hear your morning prayer. Clara and Lily knelt, their girlish voices rendered dull by their monotonous recitation of the Our Father. Clara opened her eyes halfway through the prayer when her friend started coughing again. Sister swooped in and pulled Lily to her feet. How many times have I told you to contain yourself during prayer? I'm sorry, sister, I can't help it. Well, you could at least try. Extra chores for you today. After breakfast, report to Mr. Walker in the barn. You can clean the goat enclosure today. But sister, she's sick and it's so cold out there. Clara stepped closer to her friend. Then you can help her since you're so smart. Now get dressed and ready for chapel and there'll be no breakfast for you. Let's go. She clapped her hands. Last one in line will help Clara and Lily with the goats today. The girls scrambled to form the lineup and Lily got there last. Sister laughed. You can't even help yourself, can you? Tuck in your blouse. Lily dutifully tucked in her blouse, following close behind Clara as the girls filed into the chapel. After school, Clara and Lily bundled up as best they could, their legs bare but for their darned and redarned cotton leotards. Clara set out running across the windy expanse towards the barn, but had to slow down for Lily, who barely managed a quick walk. Heads down against the wind, they watched for Mr. Walker, the farmhand. He let it be known to anyone who would listen he didn't care a whit about God or Queen, so long as someone was there to help him with the unending chores at the school. He was neither harsh nor kind, just insistent that chores be done correctly. I've been waiting for you girls. You have to stop pissing off sister. Now I have to watch out for you. Go over to the back wall. You'll find the pitchforks. The goats are in the last 2 stalls. I'll move them. You clean them out. Not 5 minutes into the job, Lily collapsed on the stall floor, unable to stop coughing. Clara knelt beside her and patted her back. You'll be okay, Lily. Just take a deep breath. Mr. Walker heard the commotion and poked his head over the stall to see Clara wiping her friend's mouth with her sleeve. The pink bubbles formed around Lily's mouth faster than Clara could wipe them. He rushed into the stall. Step away, girl. He bent and scooped Lily up in his arms and turned to leave the barn. He looked over his shoulder at Clara. Stay here and get that work done. I'll be back soon. Clara shoveled as hard as she cried, praying that Lily would be okay. That night in the dorm, the lights out, the full moon shining through the window, Clara carried on with her epic prayer for Lily. She looked first to the empty bed beside her and then to the sky. Dear Jesus, I know you see everything and must have a lot to do. Did you see Lily fall today? She's so sick with blood in her mouth. Jesus, take care of Lily. She's like that little sparrow, Jesus, like the one you saw. Make her better with your hands that can make people better. I will even stay here and not go home for Christmas if you make her better, Jesus. Amen. Clara curled up in her bed. She thought of Lily lying in the white bed in the nurse's room. She closed her eyes, the faint smell of goat rising from her as she drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Clara chose her seat in chapel carefully, close to the door. At the first, let us pray, and the scuffling sound of the children moving into a kneeling position, Clara slipped out the side door, careful to avoid the offices of the priests and the classrooms with teachers preparing for their day. She slipped into the nurse's room. The white bed was spotless, neat, and empty. Sister Philomena, with her white nurse's habit, came to Clara. Do you need a plaster? Where's Lily? She's gone, child. Gone where? Did her mom come and get her? Why didn't she say goodbye? No, child, she's gone to Jesus. Lightheaded, Clara looked at Sister. Jesus is here? Well, in a way, I suppose. Sister Philomena reached out and took Clara's hands in hers. She died last night, dear. She's with the Lord. Lily's pale little face seemed to hover in the air in front of Clara, soaking and shivering on that bench. And once again, the rage rose up in her. She leapt from the bench and ran across the parking lot, the rock raised high above her head. With a scream, she threw the rock through the lobby window of the Manitou and then raced away into the night. She could hear the wailing of the alarm bell as she ran. Who the hell would think it had an alarm? She'd run a couple of blocks when she heard the first siren. She slowed to a walk. Just a late night party, just heading home. Manitou? Nope, I wasn't there. She practiced calm replies to imagined interrogations. She made her way back to East Hastings, feeling conspicuous in the thinned out crowds. She heard the car creeping behind her, and for once she hoped it was just some creep looking for a lay. She looked at the storefront to her right and saw the reflection of the police cruiser creeping behind her, then stopping. She walked on, speeding up just a little. You, the cop called after her. Hold up. Clara stopped and turned. What? Yeah, I thought it was you. What did I tell you earlier? Clara glared at him. Just my luck. Look, I'm just heading home. I'm not making trouble. Up against the wall, I warned you. Shaking her head, resigned, Clara put her hands against the brick. The cop cuffed her and put her in the back of the cruiser. Once in the driver's seat, he looked at her in the rearview mirror. You didn't have something to do with that mess at the Manitou, did you? Clara looked out the window. What mess? Yeah, a woman across the street saw an Indian girl running away from there. All Indian girls should run away from there. They drove the short distance to the police station in silence. The cop escorted her to the drunk tank, its current residents, thankfully all asleep. Next time I tell you I don't want to see you, I mean I don't want to see you. The cell door clanked closed behind her, and she stepped around the others, looking for some space to sit. She pulled the collar of her shirt up over her nose and mouth, nauseated by the stench. Like a small miracle, the only place left to sit was by the tiny slit that passed as a window on the outside world. An old woman with long gray braids sat there looking out at the street below. Clara sat next to her and nodded a greeting. She wondered why such a beautiful old woman would be in a place like this. As though reading her mind, the woman turned to her. "Look," she said, pointing out the window with a gnarled brown finger. Clara looked and shook her head. "What?" "That little birch tree. Even here they shine." Clara looked again. A little birch no taller than Clara herself stood alone in a small square of dirt carved out of the pavement for it. The rain had stopped and the clouds parted for the muted sunlight of dawn. Clara watched as the leaves of the little tree captured the light, shining silvery and soft. The old woman looked at her with eyes as black as night and placed her hand over Clara's. "The power of creation is everywhere, in the tree, in you, in all of them." She gestured to the others. "Never forget." The old lady settled back into the variegated shadows of the cell, her deeply wrinkled hands folded in her lap. Clara gazed at the little birch, blocking out the restless sounds of the cell. As though no time had passed, Clara found herself back, way back, when she was little, walking home from church with her mum. It was a hot, dusty Sunday late in August. Clara walked along the rutted wagon path that ran through the heart of the reserve, creating a direct route home from church. Her favorite part of this road, not much more than a trail, was the few hundred feet that wound through a grove of mature silver birch. She ran her hand over the silky tops of the prairie grasses as she approached the thicket, her Sunday school lessons fresh and at the forefront of her mind. Her mother walked ahead, close enough for Clara to feel safe, far enough for her to feel free. At 6, she was old enough to join the rest of the kids at Sunday school in the basement of the church while her mother attended Mass. One of the teenage daughters of the church ladies read to the children from the oversized blue book of Bible stories, the cover pressed against her chest, the passionate illustrations facing out for the children to see. Clara was amazed each time the fishes fed everyone, railed against the injustice of Barabbas being set free while Jesus was not. She imagined herself in the powder blue veil that covered Mary's head and shoulders. As she rode her mule through Bethlehem, she quietly sang "Jesus Loves Me" without the words. La, 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 as the grasshoppers chirped and the wind sent itself rustling through the trees. Ahead, she saw her mum, Serafina, veer off the pathway towards their house, the hip-high prairie grasses as though gracious, bowing in her wake. Clara felt a burst of pride thinking about how all the church ladies gravitated to Serafina for chit-chat after the service, how they always sought out what she had to say about births and deaths, namings, and ceremonial giveaways. Clara stood for a moment, transfixed by the sunlight reflecting off the shimmering silver-green leaves, and felt the earth's summer heat rising through her feet, seeping into her bones. She stood motionless, thinking she heard something, a tinkling, like tiny bells sounding in the wind. She carried on, but heard it again, this time with a whispering sound, almost words, like a quiet chanting rising on the breeze. "Mum!" She ran to catch up with her, then walked backwards, facing her mum. "Did you hear it too?" "I didn't hear anything, Clara." Her mother turned and stood holding her daughter's hand, the child's face turned to the sky over the thicket. "Listen, Mum, listen." Smiling and slightly shaking her head at her always surprising child, her mother squeezed Clara's little hand. "Sorry, honey, I don't hear a thing." "Mom, I think the angels are playing in the trees." Her mother smiled and turned back towards the house, Clara's fingers slipping from hers. "Let's get moving, girl. Your auntie and cousins will be at the house soon." "Don't you believe me?" Clara looked up at her mum with disappointment. "Maybe it was not for others to hear. Your grandma used to say the little people played in that thicket. Maybe they were making music just for you." Clara, confident again, ran ahead of her mum, her braids bouncing against her back. Pick some rhubarb, her mother called after her. I'll make a pie. Clara veered off toward the garden. She remembered eating that rhubarb pie, playing with her cousins, and finally falling asleep in her mother's bed for what would be the last time. She remembered all the children gathered at the church the next morning, the cattle truck waiting, the priest and the RCMP standing by as the children, Clara too, were loaded into the truck. She remembered the first time she saw Sister Mary. It was long past dark when the children marched up from the dock to the mission. Sister's black robes were invisible in the night as she stood on the steps, looking like a disembodied head in her blazing white cornet. Clara remembered her battle with Sister as she cut her long braids, doused her in green powder, took her clothes away, and replaced them with a used brown shift. Her heart pounding, Clara rose from her reverie and turned to speak to the old woman, but the bench was empty. The hairs on the back of her neck stood stiff and her face flushed hot as she looked around the crowded cell for the woman. But she was nowhere. Clara turned her attention once again to the little birch, trying to calm herself. When the time came for the guard to empty the cell of the previous night's captives, Clara made a point of walking next to him. Excuse me, do you know what happened to that old lady? What old lady? The one with the braids and the long skirt. She was Indian, like me. No one like that in last night. You sobered up? Must be the DTs. Clara collected her belongings and walked out into the morning air, unable to shake the eerie feeling. Outside, she bummed a cigarette and a light, walked down to the little birch tree, pressed her hand against it, and smoked. Now, the reason that I chose that particular excerpt of the book to read is because Lily was a real person. Lily was a resident of the St. Barnabas Residential School at Onion Lake, and my mother watched her hemorrhage to death from tuberculosis on the playground. There were no goats involved, but that was my creation. That was my addition to the story. And so it brings that statistic of the number of children that died home in a very, very personal way for me. When the CBC first published the list of about 3,600 children who were known to have died at the schools, I immediately looked for Lily and found a bunch of Lilies, a couple of them from areas where they would have been at that school. And I like to feel some kind of comfort that perhaps Lily has found her way home. My mother's experiences were not limited to that horror. When she was about 11 years old, she was asked, well, not asked, but she was presented with bread at breakfast that had been contaminated by a cat, and she refused to eat it. So she was made to sit at the dining room table until she would eat it. And she was told she couldn't leave until she ate it. She sat there all night. They didn't know that my mother was a force of nature. When it became clear that she wasn't going to eat this, she was dragged up to the principal's office, and the principal told her that she was nothing but an Indian slut, and that she would never be anything but an Indian slut. And so you think about these kinds of experiences that children have had. They're now adults, their parents, grandparents, and so on. And you wonder, how can this ever be reconciled? How can this ever be made right? Which leads me to my ideas about how I perceive and define reconciliation. And I think of it in the bookkeeping sense. You know, when you get your bank statement and you have to reconcile it with your bank account, it has to balance. It has to balance. And to me, reconciliation is the restoration of balance in the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And that leads me to ask for you to post my last picture. And here we have this, reconciliation. We acknowledge that this police operation will be taking place on unceded Indigenous land. Yeah, just take a look for a second and then you can take it down again. and I don't mean to disparage land acknowledgements, not at all, because I've been involved long enough, basically my whole life, to understand that this is profound progress for non-Indigenous Canadians to acknowledge traditional territory. But the reason that I bring that forward is that the concept of reconciliation, as I see it in non-Indigenous Canada, has its limits. Reconciliation is okay as long as that doesn't interfere with the existing power relations and economic relations in Canada. The Wet'suwet'en, this arose out of my thinking about the Wet'suwet'en. Unceded means unyielded, unsold, ungiven. There's a Supreme Court of Canada decision that acknowledges that that land belongs to the Wet'suwet'en. But the power of the state is brought to fore because the acceptance, the meaningful acceptance of their ownership of that land interferes with the Canadian economy. If reconciliation is going to be meaningful, it must be substantive and it must be more than performative. There must be an acknowledgement that there has to be a shift, that non-Indigenous Canadians, that their situation will change to some degree. It must, if the situation of Indigenous peoples is going to change. And I talk about colonialism, about what's happened to us here as this systematic impoverishment of our people, which created a powerlessness. And until that is addressed, people say, we want the land back. Well, the land wants us back too. And, until there can be a sharing of resources, a meaningful sharing of resources, so that we can have the necessary resources, the resources that are necessary for us to implement healing, growth, and meaningful self-governance and self-determination, real jurisdiction, and real recognition of land that in fact belongs to us. If we don't have those things, the rest is just words. It's just talk. If the limit of reconciliation is, protect the economy, then it's not reconciliation at all. So, looking at the time, the other thing that I wanted to talk about in the context of reconciliation and my definition of reconciliation is the concept of intergenerational harm. And I think that many people perceive intergenerational harm as, harm that's done to me as the child of a survivor, of a person who went to residential school. I see it as circular. It's not linear in that way, because there was a time in this country when virtually every community, every Indigenous community was devoid of school-age children. And the first time that a child was taken, that child, of course, was deeply traumatized, but so was that child's parents. So were the grandparents. Their role of bringing that child along in their community, within traditions, within our history, within, assisting that child in finding their role in our communities was disrupted. And so that trauma, that intergenerational harm is circular in that sense, in that it starts not just with the child and their children, but with the child's parents as well. Just as we didn't experience the residential school only as individuals, we experienced that collectively as a people, as nations, as communities, as families. And so I think that also points to my belief that we must, beyond, budget contributions from the federal government, resources must be recognized as ours in order that we can reestablish ourselves and we can heal ourselves. That's what we need to be focusing on. I think time is up. Am I right? Can someone help me here?
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay.
I'm going to ask Audrey Lawrence, who is the Métis co-chair of All My Relations Circle, to thank you, and then we'll move to some questions, okay?
That would be great.
Audrey?
Michelle, time would never be up for you because your words are so powerful. I just would like to say, on behalf of the Anglican Diocese 125th Legacy Committee and the All My Relations Circle, I am so honored to give you a chimagwech for lighting a fire and welcoming us into it and highlighting the economic agenda of colonialism and all the harm it has done and the balance owed that needs to be repaid over time. Your snapshots were painful to hear, yet illuminating of the massive impact that they had on Indigenous peoples, especially the use of education as a forced assimilation and genocide. And as a former teacher of kids not in residential school, but in Noranda, Quebec, when the kids from James Bay had to come down because it was the only school nearby, I certainly can identify with the pain that they had in that circumstance, although it was nowhere near the severity of what was experienced by residential schools. Your comments this evening are challenging and inspiring, and we continue with our efforts to respond in a good way to the calls to action of the TRC and the ongoing needs of residential school survivors. We need to continue to light the fire of dialogue so that we can truly balance the ledger of reconciliation and meaningful recognition. So now at this point, we are just so inspired to want to do more. And I'm going to turn things over to Beth, who will help handle the situation of questions from the audiences and get your responses. Chimagwech.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just to remind people, if you have a question, please type it into the chat. Over to Beth now.
Thank you, Bishop Shane. Thank you, Audrey, and thank you, Michelle, so much for your words this evening. One thing, Michelle, some folks are wondering if at some point you could send us the titles and the authors of the books that you mentioned at the beginning. There were a couple there. I believe one of them was Clearing the Plains, for instance. We just, some folks would like to be able to follow up and read those later on. So it'd be great. One question was that Bishop Shane said at the beginning that Five Little Indians is a work of fiction that tells the truth about the impact of residential schools. Is that why you wrote it?
That's part of the reason that I wrote it. As time goes by, I realized that I had a lot of reasons that I wanted to write this book. But the primary reason, or what I think inspired me mostly, was my frustration. Having worked with survivors for so many years, advocating for them, and my frustration to hear this sort of ubiquitous response from non-Indigenous Canada, which is, why can't they just get over it? How many times have we heard this? Why can't they just get over it? And so I wanted to answer that question. I wanted to create something that articulated exactly, the intense psychological burden that these children left residential school with, without any kind of support when they left, without any kind of therapeutic intervention, without anything like that, which is one of the reasons that I feel so strongly that this wasn't about assimilation. If it had been about assimilation, where was the support for these kids when they left? If the real desire had been to integrate Indigenous people meaningfully, or to assimilate them even meaningfully into Canadian society, there would have been support, but there wasn't. These kids were just tossed and left, and these are people that of a generation that I worked with. And I saw these impacts, on an ongoing basis of, just being left with no skills, because really what these schools were about was mostly labor, no skills, no support, and no way of even understanding the world that they were tossed into. And you might find it interesting as an Anglican event here that the school I used in the book was based on St. Michael's in Alert Bay. I mean, I changed the denomination and I, changed the name to protect the innocent and so on. But, especially those very isolated schools when children were released, some of them would have been there from the time they were 6 till they were 16, having seen nothing else, having experienced nothing else. How could they possibly be expected to succeed, to thrive, to meet their potential? Not possible.
No. One of our participants was wondering if you attended residential school yourself.
No, blessedly. And, my mother married a non-Indigenous person. And I truly believe that this arose from the fact that she got the message. She got the message because of her residential school education that you have to be as white as possible if you're going to fly under the radar in your behavior, in your actions, in the way you live and walk in the world. And I firmly believe that, part of her motivation in marrying a non-Indigenous man, I mean, she loved my dad, that's absolutely true, but was because she lost her Indian status, her legal status as an Indian person in marrying a non-Indigenous man. And so her children were also non-Indians, were not registered as Indians, and therefore could not be taken away. And I'm sure that was part of her motivation, was to protect her kids.
Right. Now, along with obviously churches and governments have been making apologies lately, is there a way that we can help survivors and their communities to retrieve the residential school records that are being archived in places like the Vatican? Do you have any suggestions about how one might be able to help with that?
No.
Okay,
And
I thought I'd ask.
that's all right. But, and this is from somebody that, when I worked for the Department of Justice, because they actually invited me to work there. I think it was in 2000. I'm getting old and my memory is getting a bit foggy, but it was to specifically assist in the development of an alternative approach to litigation to resolving these. But I got to see firsthand how vigorously the church entities were defending against these claims of abuse. And I got to see in particular, the Roman Catholic Church and its determination not to release records, its determination not to compensate these kids, this determination not to apologize, because to apologize would be to admit liability. And it was a horrible experience to watch that. Just terrible. Yeah. So, maybe when the chiefs and the folks head over to see the Pope later on in the month, maybe the Pope will have a sudden epiphany and do the right.
It's Advent. We'll have hope for that.
I'm hopeful, if not optimistic.
Exactly. Do you see what signs of hope and optimism do you see in Indigenous communities today?
Well, I think about the fact that we are the tiniest percentage of the Canadian population. We are such a small percentage. And I go back to the 70s when I first started working with Indigenous organizations, and into the 80s. And this tiny little segment of the population accomplished just something absolutely remarkable. And that is a constitutional amendment. Okay, Quebec couldn't do it. Alberta can't do it, right? It's, and I think about, we are this tiny, powerless, segment of the population And if we can do that, what can the powerful do? And I think it's not for me to say, I think it's for them to say. And when I think about allies, I think about historically the role that Indigenous allies played in supporting either the French or the English, and the impact of that on how this country and America was carved up, so to speak. Indigenous people were allies to those colonial forces, and they were allies to the death. They stood until they could not stand anymore. And that is what non-Indigenous people need to do. They need to stand until they cannot stand anymore. It's not enough for performative responses to, our reality. We are now, I would say, in the final stage of colonialism. And as that is defined, it's when nobody needs to do anything terrible to us anymore. We're doing it to ourselves. And it's, on one hand, we have that awful reality of being the highest in all the terrible statistics: incarceration, addiction, suicide, being a murder victim, being a sexual assault victim. All of those statistics, we are number one. And on the other hand, we have this phenomenal will to survive as we are, as the people that we are. And if only we could have the support, the meaningful support beyond words, we would be able to reestablish self-governance, self-determination, and healing for our own communities. But it's very difficult to do when you haven't got two nickels to rub together.
Right. Are you optimistic about Indigenous peoples regaining control of their natural resources on their lands, or where do you think that's going at the moment?
Well, that's the only thing that's going to really solve the problem. And so I have to be optimistic about it. I've been fighting for that my whole life, right? And now here I am in my third act. I can't give up. So, and I believe that there has been movement. I mean, I don't want to present as a negative person without hope or faith or without appreciation even for, the gains that have been made in Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations. I see that progress. I just wonder, it feels like a race to me. Will meaningful reconciliation occur in time?
So besides using things like land acknowledgements and talking about unceded territory, for those of us who are non-Indigenous, how can we practically help or stand with you? How in my everyday life, what could I do?
Write letters. That's one thing. Look what Amnesty International does with their letter writing campaign. Can you imagine if even 50% of Canadians wrote a letter to their MP and said, this has to be fixed once and for all. And if you don't, I'm not voting for you again. Because, that's what it's all about, right? Is, maintaining power and so on. But, and that's why I raised the question of what we were able to do or not the question, but the point of, what we were able to do as this tiny percentage of the population. Non-Indigenous Canada has all the power. If we can effect a constitutional amendment, you guys imagine what you can do with your positions of privilege and power. And, I don't use the word privilege as an insult. I mean, or to suggest that non-Indigenous Canadians have had life easy and, so on and so forth. That's not true. We all have our struggles and our, roadblocks to overcome in our lives, but non-Indigenous Canadians don't have to overcome the color of their skin from the moment that they're born, which is what we have to do. And so, and I also think one of the most important things that non-Indigenous Canadians can do is to educate yourselves, accept responsibility for your own education. That burden has been placed on Indigenous shoulders for a long time, that we have been the ones that have initiated education of non-Indigenous peoples. And it used to be that it was very difficult to find, you had to go to the dusty archives, you had to, do all that kind of stuff to find information about what's happened in colonial Canada and so on. It's not hard anymore. We have Google, for goodness sakes. So many of these archives are online now. People can educate themselves without a tremendous amount of difficulty. And so that, I think, is a very important first step, is for people to know exactly what they're talking about and to stop relying on stereotypes and false beliefs. I'll tell you a little anecdote. Some years back, I taught a history course at UBC, and it was called the History of Native People in Canada. It was a year-long course. I said, "You're only giving me a year?" And I changed it to, the history of Aboriginal people at the time. And the first thing I did in that class, which was predominantly non-Indigenous, was to ask people, my students, everything they knew about Indigenous people. Everybody was so uncomfortable. So I put them at ease as best I could. And they started. And, they worked up a head of steam in no time and were spouting all of the stereotypes about Indigenous people, like this stereotype that I introduced to you earlier about Indigenous women. And so then it stopped, the discussion stopped naturally. And then I said, okay, second question. How do you know that to be true? They were stunned. Not a single one could say how they had learned or how that they came to believe those things as being true. And this is the power of the relationship between media and government during the colonial times, and the role that the media played in perpetrating these false stereotypes to further that colonial agenda. But those things, we're not the only people that have an oral tradition. Parents speak to their children speak to their children speak to their children. And then you have these, otherwise intelligent, warm history students completely aghast that they don't know how they know something. And so I ask everybody to ask themselves that question. What do you think you know, and how do you know it? And if that doesn't match up, get to work.
That's great. That's a great advice. One of our participants was wondering, was your mother able to teach you about your culture, your Indigenous culture? And did she get to know about this amazing work that you're doing for your people?
No. My mother, as I said earlier, my mother was a pro-assimilation person because of that message that she got, that I spoke of, that white is right, be as white as you can. And I could go on. But my mother also passed away the year, just a few months before I graduated from law school, because I graduated from law school, I was 43. I went when I was older. And but she knew of my work with Indigenous organizations. And because of her, self-preserving beliefs, I think is the best way of putting it. It was really on my shoulders to come to understand Cree culture and to, reestablish relationships with my grandparents and my aunties and uncles and so on and so forth. And that was something I was driven to do from the time I was very, very young.
And what advice is that the kind of advice you would give to Indigenous children or youth today? What would you tell them? If you could tell them anything at all, what to do, what would you?
Goodness. Goodness, right? Stay focused on the goodness and, educate yourself also in terms of why we, that the generation that is, you know, older than them, that is their parents and grandparents now, why we fought so hard and what we were fighting so hard for, which is our integrity as a people.
Look for the birch trees.
Look for the birch trees. It's medicine.
Exactly. That's wonderful. Wonderful. I don't know. I have another, trying to read questions at the same time as asking to you. So I guess one other question is how we can, well, I think you told us, but how we can counter government officials from sort of keeping to the, how we can counter their not truth telling, their non-truth telling. How can we hold that up against them?
Just ignore them, tell the truth, right? And counter what they say. You know, don't just accept it because they're in a position of power. Question. And, you know, like I say, go to these places where you can find so much information. I mean, now, it's unheard of. You know, when I was a young woman, I can think of 2 Indigenous women in Canada that were published, Maria Campbell and Lee Miracle. And one more, Jeanette Armstrong, but she came a little bit later in the 80s. And now, and this is something that came from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to some degree, Indigenous people really knocked down the doors to the publishing industry. We had to, in order to have our stories accepted and shared. But one of the things that the Truth and Reconciliation, one of the calls to action was to create greater funding opportunities through the Canada Council to support Indigenous creators, novelists, writers, artists, and so on and so forth. And that has really helped. It's absolutely helped. You know, so every time you hear some nonsense, go to the calls to action and see what they refer to and see what you see there, because those calls to action were accepted. The Yellowhead Institute last year did this is a really good thing to look up. They did an assessment of where the government is at in terms of implementing the calls to action. And at that point, I think there might be one more now, but at that point, 6.
Did you say 6?
6.
6.
6 of the calls to action had been addressed, and each of those 6 calls to actions were one-offs. I mean, they were important. Some of them were important one-offs, like the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, but they were still one-offs. And so the reason that I say that is because it is such a huge challenge to address the systemic nature of racism and discrimination in the country. It requires, I mean, like even my example earlier about the RCMP being the Northwest Mounted Police being the predecessor to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Just last spring, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police tweeted this anniversary of the Frog Lake incident and the loss of life of 2 Northwest Mounted Police officers. And the tone of that message that was on Twitter, it took me right back. It made me feel like I was alive in 1885. and these were actual Northwest Mounted Police officers that were speaking of their fallen comrades. And, in virtually every institution, every Canadian institution, there is this ingrained systemic bias against Indigenous people. And so the majority of these calls to action requires systemic change, and systemic change is extremely difficult if there is no will, if the will in the particular institution is not there. So I think in some institutions you see a greater amenability, if you will, to meaningful systemic change, but in many, no.
Well, I think, Michelle, I think we're kind of at the end of the questions, but I just want to say I read the book in one sitting. one day this summer. And I think one of the wonderful ways in which you relate to people through that book is just through your characters. They're almost archetypal. And so I could recognize something of my story and I'm not Indigenous at all, at all whatsoever. And I think that's where, when our hearts are changed, then it's a lot easier to see the circles and the influence. So thank you for doing that for us.
Well, and that was one of the reasons that I elected to go with fiction as opposed to writing another nonfiction academic kind of tome, which I could have, was first to honor our Indigenous education through storytelling, that tradition, but also because I felt it would be easier for people to open their hearts, open their minds through storytelling. And I think that's happened. I think that many people have been moved, and I am very thankful for that. Very, very thankful.
Thank you. Bishop Shane.
Michelle, we are very thankful for you and for sharing your good words with us this evening. No pun intended, but your good words and your good thoughts. And I really took to heart your words about the situation for non-Indigenous people does need to change. You know, it's not something that we're waiting to have happen around us. It has to happen within our hearts and minds and in the structures that we've created and for the most part continue to benefit from. So thank you so much for highlighting the need for that profound kind of change, which in the end will make us all more fully human.
I agree.
Yeah. I want to thank everyone for coming this evening, those of you who are on this Zoom call and those of you who are joining us through live stream. Without being too much of an advertisement for this series, I would point out that the next lecture is on Monday, January 17th, and it's with the Reverend Dr. Jason McKinney, not Jason Kenney, Jason McKinney, who will be talking about the Church as Commons, a theological case for affordable housing. And in February, there'll be a panel discussion on signs of hope in the fight against climate change. And in March, the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells will help us reimagine church, as we all need to reimagine our lives at this time in order to enter into a better relationship with one another and a better relationship with Creator. So go in peace, everyone, and may the Creator of peace be with you and those you love this day and always. Good night now, and good night. Bye.
Good night, and thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.